I'm gonna do like a redo on another anime. But what anime should I do a redo on next? An anime? So many to choose from. Which one? Haven't. What is this? I'll cover that someday, but not right now. I haven't reviewed that yet, but for another time. What's this? I'll save it for the future, for another time. What's this one? Oh, save it for another time. This one? I still need to watch, but don't want any spoilers. Already did a redo on that already. And what's this? Vampire Hunter D? You mean the 80s anime favorite for old school anime fans? Yep. I'm gonna do a redo on Vampire Hunter D, this classic anime from 1985. Let's do this, because this is Anime Retrospect. Here we are again on Anime Retrospect. This anime we're going to be talking about for something that has to do with vampires. Beside the regular ones that we know in general, particularly, but it's not like how you would expect to researching as well. Oh, it's not the first vampire movies of it, or in television, or in novels of its kind. Well, what am I bringing this up? Well, today's subject, we're going to be talking about a well-known, acclaimed otaku classic, which is funded by old school anime in everywhere, which brings us to the great example of 80s anime, and I'm going to be talking about Vampire Hunter D, an anime movie OVA, or a movie in general, which I genuinely love, even though I have been seeing this lots of times on the VHS back in the day as well. Yeah. Vampire Hunter D was based on the series of novels by Hideyuki Kikuchi, who is the author on Wicked City as well. And accordingly, didn't you know that this one is based on the novel, like this one here, which is basically, it's written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, and the illustrations are done by Yoshitaka Amano, who designing for the old Final Fantasy character ones as well. But Vampire Hunter D is the one that they got the attention the most, particularly for an old school anime favorite. Particularly, as from what I understand as well. This was released back in December 21st, 1986. No, 85 actually. Because this is a great example. Because 1985, which is, I think this is around the same time as Odin, Photon, Sailor Starlight, The Dagger of Kamui, and Urusei Yatsura movie 4, Lum the Forever, as well. But Vampire Hunter D, on the other hand, is basically the first example of the 80s anime. But we'll get to the characters in just a moment. So without any further ado, which is right here, right now, this is Vampire Hunter D. Okay, so the story takes place of how it sets off in a distant future which is plagued by vampires and monsters in a post-apocalyptic future, which is basically like this setting basically feels like a cross between a Hammer horror movie and one of those like Western movies as well. We get to the characters who we introduced. The main human character is Doris Lang, who was basically a werewolf hunter who was on her horse until she notices something going on from out of nowhere. But after defeating a monster, which is basically like a mutant dinosaur-looking creature, until it killed the horse, but then all of it. But she ends up basically of how she notices basically of how the creature shapes into a werewolf after it's killing the horse as well. But that wasn't long when she encountering the mysterious force, which it happens that the domain belongs to Count Magnus Lee. So when Count Magnus Lee is a vampire lord, basically, which is the once was forgotten, he wanted to make doors until he's a vampire bride, especially in his orders. Therefore, he can gain the ultimate power. Of course, she does not want it, because she's a werewolf hunter. When she is trying to look for someone to protect her, but then she ends up seeing a mysterious character who happens to be riding on the horse, basically, when she was ending up wanting to attack him if he was worthy enough. Pretty much of how it happens when she puts out a bunch of ipsolium, and when he was completely unfazed, when this guy is definitely worthy, so he happens to be known as D himself, a vampire hunter himself, because he's the main character who is down here so pretty much. He's basically known as a Damphyr, a half-human, half-vampire, which even though he is basically a half-vampire, he has the code of honor when he really does protect the weak. So he ends up hired by Doris Lang. So when they return to her hometown, Dee ends up meeting up with Doris Lang's younger brother, who is named Dan, which you realize something of how there's those characters which you begin with. You got how this going quite well. So amusing of how this goes. When they return back to the town, the mayor's son, who happens to be named Greco, who's basically, ironically enough, he's basically your typical kind of looks of like Yasin from Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam series, which it was kind of very familiar of how you see in this anime. He forces himself onto her, trying to make her an offer when he wants to protect her, but she doesn't refuse him because he maybe wanted to be so strange or deranged of how he's getting pissed off and ends up telling everyone in the city that there's a secret, that she basically thinks that she was bitten by a vampire. It was just losing their minds over at the end of this happening in the mayor's office, when they end up insisting that they wanted Doris to be in quarantine, when she doesn't return trying to kill everyone in the town, when they say that they would release her if Dee did happen to kill Count Magnus Lee. Later that night, he ends up hearing something outside, and it just happens to be attacked by two people. That happens to be Ray and Lamia, where Ray is basically the servant to Count Magnus Lee, and then Mika is his daughter. So Dee wants to compromise the two, which they know that he's trying to protect Doris, and they don't like that. And then you get pretty cool fight scenes going on. When this ends up, it takes matters worse into its own hands, where he wants to go to the castle himself. When he wants to talk to him, where as the film turns into like its own little Castlevania type way, in the movie goes in its particular way. When Dee came to 1 year prior, in the first kind of how it wonders, is basically how you expect finding something when he was fighting up with these monsters, including those creepy looking monsters, especially when D has a special power with his left hand as well. It's basically in his own mind and consciousness of how it actually helps with certain various things. When D is in the middle of the castle left hand, so it's telling him it's not trapped, and he goes like, he basically wanted to do something what he should have done. When he sees a three-headed snake ladies, which is like a Medusa type of thing, they were trying to seduce him, though. Since Doris is getting kidnapped by the Rage, when he brings her to Count Magnus Lee, when D has to rescue Doris Lang after he just kills off those three-headed snake women ones, which is the kind of how you expect of how the story goes. It has to be look cheerful as well as how everything happens. Pretty much seems up to how you know about Vampire Hunter D, is basically how this thing goes, of how the elements in the plot is very straightforward of how this goes. It's basically how it stands up the fact of how D has to fight off those monsters, though, and then he had to rescue Doris after the thing just goes by. Has to be learning to the fact of how there's any more compliments of how it was basically how to expect to see something from the story goes, especially yet another kind of how the is basically your typical anime like Vampire Hunter D in its own certain manner of how it feels in a more sweep towards of how this dark booming sounds with those types of atmospheric music, particularly in between perspective of how their own missions of how to expect what is going on. So yeah, this happens in this kind of modern day standard of how Vampire Hunter D was to explain what it is as well. It's like, where does it go? Like, how did D rescue Doris Lang after he has basically got the thing for how this particular goes on? That's how he escapes her from the he had to rescue her from the castle as well as how it is expect. Yeah, this is basically how this comes of how the story progresses of how you want to know about Vampire Hunter D, of how when this, I guess basically that's how Magnus sent out his daughter, those two servants, basically how basically has other than defeating the snake ladies and then rescuing Doris Lang from the cat, as how he goes in the alibi type when they ever since they were escaping the castle, basically as well. Greco is angry over Doors rejected when then notice something going on that killing that bad will be difficult when Count Magnus Lee has the lot always wanted to do. Of course, this is basically a trap. When Ray is basically has that candle where he go to send the light where to paralyze any vampire of its reason when it doesn't work, when it slices D's hands, when he was basically battling with Ray in this particular scene as the night before. Ever since she can build the killer's father intended bride to be, as basically when Doris and Lamia notices the light of how something repentless as how this goes, how what it goes in Vampire Hunter D. maybe the fact is how it can make it more clearer. Just before Greco almost kills any mankind, the futile attempt to force Doris to be his. That when D is basically makes the save what kinds of the shooting. It's later on, after everyone goes back to the ranch talking with them to be a bit freaked out, she just endures to. She wanted to comfort D in its own sort of romantic kind, but there was no vampire bite on her neck because she was very lucky. D doesn't know if he could understand if he could have bite her in the neck, but there is no blood in it because he's a Damphir. Just because he's a half human, half vampire, but he's still a vampire hunter. That's the thing. And it's indeed of how when the next morning comes, Ray just comes around with a real vampire repellent, which has basically recovered still from the previous scene in this. Had to be after when he was weakening D with that sort of light, like a lantern, where it flashes D, which is killing them off screen, which it actually works on D, and could have almost killed him, but instead it slices his lefty hand as well, with the face on it, on the palm of the hand. But instead, it basically retaches itself, particularly in a nearby. Once his arm, it repairs himself, he's basically feel recovered. Meanwhile, Dan wanted to realize of what Count Magnus Lee is up to something, but he tried to attack Count but it didn't work because these types of course, he wanted to know about the repentance of. Instead, he kills one of his own servants in the bloody battle because Count Magnus Lee wanted Doris Lane to be his bride in this scene of this particular part of. And yes, it did kill one of his servants with his head blood, brains splattered and blood everywhere. But that wasn't long until a knife is in something through the knife-looking weapon into Count Magnus Lee's eyes, when it was D who might have killed, because he has the revenge to attack Count Magnus Lee as well, especially with his bladed sword weapon in its own way. And then when he kills Count Magnus Lee, sticking him into the wall, the blood is coming out of the body. So much blood in this pouring out of Count Magnus Lee's chest, which is part until how he wanted to realize how his last breath that Dee's real father was Dracula himself, as the castle begins to destroy itself, until Dee and the others had to escape from the castle, particularly after Count Magnus Lee was defeated, and the castle begins crumbling down to the floor. Because this wasn't long until Doris and her brother Dan were waving goodbye to Dee, until Dee is back into his horse when he rides off into from town to town, going places from nowhere, as how it goes, until he went to the sunset. And that's how, never knowing that it's memorable. This is the memorable scene where he can go from any nowhere, and that's how you end this movie, with how he went off into the sunset with a horse as well. The animation in the story in Vampire Hunter D, it looks good. It looks very different, and basically how it's adapted from the original novel, basically from what Hideyuki Kikuchi had a lot to do, because the story was well done. I thought it was very creative as well. I loved it because, well, it's your typical type of horror story with a little mix of like post-apocalyptic gothic setting, and with a little bit of something coming out of a Western movie as well. The story was great, though. The characters and all, the inspiration for the character D, basically, is how they picture what Hideyuki Kikuchi has created the character D on it. It pictures Phil Collins in the Don't Lose My Number video as well. Yeah, the characters are great and all. I mean, and he's basically the main inspiration of how, until Steven Sommers acknowledges the design of D from Vampire Hunter D for Hugh Jackman's character in Steven Sommers' 2004 blockbuster film Van Helsing, which is, I think, later on in 2004 as well. Yeah, the character is basically, and Count Magnus Lee is like your typical, like, Hammer Dracula style, like, inspiration, though, because this is the original visualization of how it's something feel like if Toho Company would have collaborated with Hammer Films as well, or something. Because I think that's the basic visual story as well. The sound was good, though, because we all know it may be good at all, but sometimes it can be a little, almost at this point. The music is good, though, because the music is very atmospheric, and it's very dark, though, unlike any other anime, though. And the overall, if you love old 80s anime, and if you loved watching old school anime, because especially if you grew up watching anime on the VHS and Laserdisc days, because the English dub for the anime Vampire Hunter D is made by Streamline Pictures back in '92 until Sentai Filmworks got the Blu-ray release with the new English dub. The cast on here, the character D was voiced in the original Japanese dub, is voiced by Kaneto Shiozawa, who was the voice of Aramis from D'Artagnan and the Three Muskehounds in that one. Yeah, because that's quite obvious, though, as well as every other character's voice from other anime out there, which we all know in general, particularly. Especially the cast that are known for other anime in this one as well. But overall, if you haven't watched something, if you want to watch an old anime, like, good for a change, though, which is very classic and it's very old school feeling, if you want to watch an older anime, if you ever been into 80s anime in general, get it. I highly recommend Vampire Hunter D. If you can watch it on DVD or VHS or Blu-ray, this is the perfect example of the old anime from the 80s on here as well, from what I understand. Also, it's basically, my score for this one, a 5. Basically a 5. That's just my opinion, though. And basically, for Vampire Hunter D, what I like about this one as well, I'm pretty very fun to rewatch this movie on there. Especially if you ever been watching, like, whenever I come by on old anime, though, because this was dubbed by Streamline Pictures, which is known for their work on other anime, such as Akira, as well as Robot Carnival, Fist of the North Star, Wicked City, as well as Lily Cat, and many other anime, and Golgo 13 the Professional, or any other 80s anime that has got the old English dub back in the day, especially what Carl Macek had a lot to do for it as well. And also, happy anniversary to this anime, because this anime has came out on this day as well. Because this was back in 1985, especially for an old anime like, I believe, Vampire Hunter D as well. And not to mention, there is also a prequel to Vampire Hunter D, which is, I believe it's called Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, which ironically, everybody knows Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust has got the more attention of how this goes. which I will cover Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust in the future for the most part here, if anybody wants to claim me for a rewatch as well. Yeah, it's been a while since I've seen Vampire Hunter D, the original one, because this was basically how it's the great example of old anime on there. Yeah, you know what I mean as well. Because Vampire Hunter D is the classic anime as well. Because there's a great example of other vampires in anime. Before there, you had Hellsing as well as Rosario Vampire as well. But ironically, those came out in the early 2000s. But Vampire Hunter D is something that has got to take the cake. If you ever loved old school anime, or if you ever been watching a lot of 80s anime in general as well. But Vampire Hunter D is the well-known, popular, acclaimed anime classic as well. Because I really love this movie. Because, well, the English dub from Sentai Filmworks is the new dub, though. But the one I have on VHS is the Streamline Pictures English dub. But I like to watch it in its original Japanese on there. Because there's most of the cast on there on Vampire Hunter D is included. Such as which is basically from any other anime ever before or since. Well, you get the picture. It's basically of every other voice actor, Japanese voice actors that are voicing every other anime character of its kind as well. If you ever loved watching anime, like this one as well. So, that's the thing for this. Yeah, because I always known about the inspiration and the hype. Because I was very overwhelmed by the power on Vampire Hunter D. And didn't you know that this was directed by Toyo Ishida? Because this was directed by Toyo Ishida, who brought you the Fist of the North Star series and the movie as well. And also, D from Vampire Hunter D makes a cameo in Fist of the North Star, the movie, which is later on in 1980, which is, I think, about 1 year later, in 1986. And speaking of which, Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star makes a cameo in the Vampire Hunter D. Oh, I didn't know about that until now. Is it? Well, that's a bit of a nice little trivia to this as well. Because I didn't know that they have every cameos from from any anime in there. But the character, it kind of looks like Kenshiro, minus the titanium shoulder armor on the vest, what Kenshiro has. I mean, this isn't actually an attempt to hide the fact. That's why. Because I was overwhelmed when they used cameos from every other character from any anime out there. Well, also, it's not like how they use characters from any anime. Well, there's some out there in general of its kind as well. Well, this is basically how before, and also not to mention, Vampire Hunter D is still a thing in the 80s in Japan, before Castlevania was still a thing at the time as well, from what I understand as well. And also, same with Hellsing, which is later on in the early 2000s as well, from what I understand. So that's going to be it for my re-review, like a redo on Vampire Hunter D for the first time here on Anime Retrospect for today, you guys. Thank you for watching, but before we go, here's what I'm going to say for this one. Well, this is a journey of how I'm going into revisiting Vampire Hunter D for the very first time because, well, you get the point, though, because this is going into a big revisiting for this old anime classic favorite as well, from what I understand, like this one as well. Hope to subscribe for content. My Anime Planet link in the description down below. If you share this video on your Twitter and Facebook. If you have Twitter and Facebook account and all social media, smack the like button if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave in the comments section below in this video if you like as well. Let me know. What are your thoughts on Vampire Hunter D? Let me know in the comments section below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, RuRoniK95. Feel free to join my channel, especially if you're new to my channel as a newcomer. Smack the notifications bell and be sure to get notified as well. Keep it otaku for this redo because I had to go into revisiting Vampire Hunter D for the first time. That's why. Because I consider this to be a classic favorite. Because I think this came out in the 80s during the golden age era of anime. That's why. This is RuRoniK95 saying thank you for watching my video. And stay tuned. We're going to be discussing about my ranking on Christmas episodes and a Christmas special in anime. Till next time. Because I'll see you there.